Welcome to M.E.S.H. My name is Pamela Brewer, and I'm going to be here with you every week to talk about your mental, emotional, and social health because that's all in play every single day, all day long. We don't think about it, but it's true. Let me remind you one more thing. The best possible way to get yourself into relationship trouble is to assume someone else can read your mind and that you can read theirs. It's the swiftest way possible to get yourself into an exhausting communications merry-go-round without anybody having a good time. What should you do instead? Ask questions. My name is Pamela Brewer, and I'll be back in just a second, and I'll be asking questions. Deborah Fox, how are you? Welcome to M.E.S.H.
I am great. Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Well, now, Deborah, you've got a couple of things that you do that I'm going to ask you to explain. You are a licensed clinical social worker. You are a psychotherapist. I get all of that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Imago Relationship Therapy. I'm going to ask you what that means. And I know that you are also a certified sex therapist. And so, you know that there are lots of theories about what a sex therapist is. So let's start with Imago. We'll go to sex, and then we'll have a real conversation, real conversation.
Imago Relationship Therapy is that could take a long time, but it's a very structured way of having couples learn to relate to each other differently and really understand a lot of how their personal history has entered into their relationship and sometimes is creating some sparks. So it's that structured piece of it is really, really important. And I can say more about that why later. And you also asked about sex therapy. Could you help me be more specific in answering your question?
Well, I recognize that you are trained
Yes.
as a sex therapist, but you and I, assuming that we have both looked at television at some point in our lives, we've heard all kinds of things about sex therapists. So let's explode some of those myths. What is it that a credible clinical sex therapist actually does?
Okay, great. Yes, what it is it's a lot of a behavioral approach to solving sexual relationship difficulties. So what happens my office is we have a conversation. We figure out what it is that's getting in the way, which can be a whole myriad of things. But always what it's going to come down to is what is that couple going to do at home that's really going to further the resolution of whatever difficulties they're experiencing. And so it's a pretty structured approach again, in terms of being able to follow a protocol that's going to help them either solve a physical difficulty or a relationship, a more emotional difficulty. But without that structured approach, hey, what are you going to do at home? Because we can't just sit around and talk about it
Right.
and magically expect something's going to happen.
So let me go back to Imago therapy, and I'm going to ask you to explain, when does someone know that considering working with a couples therapist makes sense? Is there ever a time it's too soon? Is there ever a time it's too late?
I would say basically no. I have known some Imago therapists who have basically gifted a workshop to their newly married children, because
Interesting.
there's so much that they can learn that really will help them tremendously, because we all know that conflict is a part of any relationship. And so the sooner you can learn how to approach, how you can talk about things that are your differences or tension points, you're in a so much better position to be able to move forward in a relationship. And in terms of too late, sometimes, but I think when that happens, it's more because maybe this was not a couple meant to be.
Right.
I've had many couples come in who are on the verge of the divorce and they just want to check this last box. And we've turned that around. So I
Gotcha.
would say anytime is the best time.
I know you've had this in your office as well. I've certainly had couples come in and they're very proud of the fact that they grew up in a conflict-free home. Their parents never argued. It was blissful. And they may even go so far as to saying they never argue. Everything is great. Chris, you're sitting in a therapist's office, presumably for more than to have a cup of coffee. So what's the value, if any, or what's the red flag, if any, when you hear someone say, "Oh, we never had any conflict"? Is that a problem?
Well, to your point, they're there for a reason. And
Right.
it may be that that conflict is not overt. They're not having harsh words, they're not screaming, but they're probably feeling pretty disconnected. And
Yes.
disconnected can have a lot of different looks. It can be sort of a quiet resignation, it can be living kind of more parallel lives, but they're not feeling that connection that most likely is what brought them together. And what's gotten in the way? That's the question.
So many couples, particularly if they've been together for a while, their anticipation is that the magic is going to go, not just change, but just go. Their anticipation is that life is about bills and work and maybe children and task oriented, but not relationship oriented, not connection oriented. What do you say to those couples?
Well, I think that again, they're there for a reason, is because whatever their anticipation was, it wasn't this,
Right.
and
Fair enough.
and maybe, they are climbing the ladder and they are really focused on business or keeping up with their neighbors or whatever. But what happens is they're not feeling like they want to feel. And so that's what is really bringing them, into their office. And often they may not know the word disconnection. But when you say it, they go, yeah, that's it. That's what's missing. We used to feel connected and now we're not anymore.
I wonder if part of it isn't, if you expect it to fail, it's gonna, because you're gonna help it consciously or unconsciously. If you expect to miss the magic or the connection, by golly, it's gonna be gone at some point.
Yes. Now it's interesting you say that, Pamela, because I have a lot of the experience of the opposite one where they aren't expecting the magic to fail,
Ah,
and they say, what at one time felt so right now feels so wrong. What happened?
and even as I say, they expect the magic to fail. That's not a happy expectation. So that same couple is likely to show up in your office. They're just using different language. Uh,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's
yeah.
probably, yeah, I think that is true. Yeah.
When you've got a situation, and there's so many different kinds of couples nowadays,
Hmm.
they're living together, they're living apart, there's two, there's three. I mean, there's so many different things. But about the sexual piece, certainly I've heard couples say, well, he just doesn't have the same drive I do, or she's just really never interested in me, or, if it's not Thursday at 6:30, it's just not going to happen. What do you say to those situations, to those people?
Well, that is one of the most common complaints of people. And what I will say is to everybody is, look, what you're experiencing is so, so common that in those first period of time of your relationship, whether it was 6 months or 5 years, where things seem to click right along and now it's not. That is kind of normal. And so what people don't understand is that they usually are partnered up with someone who has a different sexual style. There are those people who just a sexual interest just is kind of intrinsic. It just pops up. It's there. But there's a whole other class of people, and as my husband so rightly said at one point, that's not what they show you in the movies. And that other style is termed responsive sexual desire. And that style is what really typifies that style is that things it's so context driven.
Hmm.
So things like fatigue or worry about a work deadline, or you have a problem with a child or a relative who's ill, that these things are not just factors, they are determinants. They are
Ah,
central to whether somebody can be open and willing to engage in physical contact. And I'm using that open and willing very deliberately as opposed to having desire, because for this group of people, particularly often, desire comes after arousal, which is
yeah,
also something we don't understand in our culture because
right,
our movies, which
right,
is our major source of sex education,
right.
they don't talk about that part. So,
No.
really understanding those two things is a huge beginning.
Well, you're right. In the movies, you see the person, they see you, it's magic, and oh my goodness, you can barely stay away from each other. I'm keeping it
Exactly.
clean.
Exactly.
It's not that way. The impact of children uh, in couples relationships. Certainly, there are folks who have lived a life of putting the children first. It's always about the children first. And then there are others who perhaps have some trouble with that. When do I get to be my partner's priority? Why is it always the children? Can you speak to those
Yeah,
experiences?
so that's a big one. It's so important for a couple to keep their coupleness,
Yeah.
and not just become parents. And so it's a balancing act. I always are saying to couples, it's so important that you have some dates. And those dates don't have to be expensive, they don't have to be at night, but they have to be just the two of you, that don't include your kids, which is challenging, of course. Babysitters can be expensive if you don't have extended family around, and you have to get creative. But it really does supply, I think, the juice and the sense of connection for couples to really keep that part of their relationship alive and not have it get subsumed by being parents.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it really is important to keep each other in the foreground. The children are absolutely critically important, but don't forget each other.
Absolutely.
For couples where there has been infidelity, and I know we don't have the time to go through all of that, but when there is an instance of infidelity, does that mean the relationship is over? Can that relationship be saved? I know a lot of it has to do with the players, but if you have an overall thought about that.
It does not have to be over. I mean, there's so many things that go into it because every circumstance is different. Um, but there's been a rupture, and when that happens, and the space between them, if you will, the
Yeah,
atmosphere in which they live in
yeah.
now with each other, it's not so safe. And so it's very important to be, I think, working with a therapist. I think it's kind of hard for any couple to do this on their own
Yeah.
because there's a lot that needs to be talked about and brought to the surface to reconnect, to build that safety again and build the trust again. So it's a process. It's not a quick fix, but it can be done. Absolutely. I've done it many times.
And that's really important because so many people think that's it, it's over, we're never going to trust again. And then again, for another time, perhaps there are all kinds of things that can get in the way even of recovering from that.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so that clearly there's work to be done and it cannot be ignored. Um,
Right, right. Otherwise, it just sits there and simmers and erupts in some other way.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
For the couples who come in, they're absolutely volatile couple, and all they want you to do is to tell them which one is right. What do you do with that?
That is so true. Well, from the moment they walk into my office, they're pretty sure that's not gonna happen. And the
Oh,
reason that
shucks.
is because, I'm really their guide. I have them sit facing each other because 'cause I'm guiding a conversation between the two of them, as much as I am interacting with them. And it's all about that, developing that dialogue, and over time allowing that to go deeper and deeper. They don't get they only get one chance to argue in my office, which is the very first 10 minutes in which they come in. I'll say, have your worst argument. It's your last time you kind of get to do that here. And so after, but of course, most people don't, because I'm there and it feels too uncomfortable to argue. But um, after that, it's really about them. And the way I structure sessions, it's very clear that that's what's happening. It's not sort of a constant three-way dialogue. Well, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? It's the two of them talking to each other.
Is there a way to know that the therapist you're working with is not a good fit for you? Is there such a thing?
Well, I think it's your comfort level, and usually a few sessions is going to, um, I think, let any couple know that, whether they feel comfortable, whether what the therapist has, how she or he works with them, whether it's making sense, and they should have a different experience in the office in terms of connection to each other,
Ah,
because we can't just talk
mm,
in the office and then they're going to go home and feel connected. They
exactly.
need to have a different kind of experience in the therapist's office of feeling connected. And to me, that's the cornerstone.
And connection, while it is absolutely the cornerstone, sometimes it's so scary to open yourself up to really deepening that connection.
Oh, totally. And that's so much of what couples therapy is all about.
When there is a situation where perhaps, and I'm going to talk about remarries. So there's a step somebody involved,
Hmm.
and the child is really given more authority, more power, if you will, more say so in what happens. And often it's the parent who's maybe feeling guilty about no longer being with the original spouse, or the child is blaming the parent. What happens in those situations? Does the child get to run the show?
Mm. Well, I think children are rarely really equipped to run the show, even though they may be doing that. So again, that topic is going to be the couple, reconnect, um, sort of maintain asserting their connection, if you will, with each other, not necessarily with the child per se.
Right.
But step parenting, step families are very, really, really complicated, because they're not the parent of the other's children.
Right.
And so developing that relationship is important. And but the couple still that new couple, the step parent involved, they have to be, again, keeping their relationship alive, and not having the children be always in the middle of that. And it's a challenge. Those are difficult dynamics to
Yeah.
unpack.
Well, and I'm hearing so many different reasons why a couple, married or unmarried, really needs to come in and do some work just around their connection. And it sounds like what you're saying is they're kind of going to know that there's something up. And whether it's the beginning of the relationship where they just want to make sure that the beginning that's wonderful stays wonderful, or if it's really
Hmm.
feeling like they're ready to head out the door, perhaps therapy is very often a very reasonable risk, but gift at the same time.
Absolutely. It is a gift. And I love that word you're using, because it is a gift. We all get stuck, and when we get stuck and we can't really feel the way we want to feel,
Yeah.
please get help. It's available.
Speaking of getting help, I would like for you to let us know where you work, what areas you work in, what locations, and how folks can get in touch if they wish to be in touch for more information. I think you have a website, so give us that information.
Sure. I practice in Northwest Washington, D.C., and my website is debfox.com. And anything you want to find out about me is there, except for articles that I write that I forget to put up on that website.
Been there, done that.
There's some on Medium.
Spell Deb, spell Fox, just so everybody's clear.
Absolutely. DEB as in boy, Fox, FOX.com.
Terrific. Deborah, thank you so very much for joining us today. It's been filled with, I think, really important information. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
And folks, thank you for joining us today. Again, I'm going to ask you to click the button to subscribe. And as you know, I am here every Wednesday with a topic of importance to you. And it's a topic that's always going to be about your mental, emotional, or social health. Thanks again for tuning in. Take care. Well, folks, I'm Pamela Brewer, and this brings us to a close of this edition of M.E.S.H. I really want to thank you for joining me today here at M.E.S.H, where your mental, emotional, and social health is always on the agenda. I hope today's conversation has been helpful. And if it has, I'm going to ask you to hit that subscribe button and share this conversation with someone you care about. I'll be back next week with another conversation about all the pieces of our lives that shape our mental, emotional, and social health. And one more thing I want to remind you of. Not your job to read someone else's mind. I don't care if you've been together for 100 years. Not your job to read someone else's mind. Not their job to read yours. Don't assume. Ask questions. You take care. See you next week.